Hey all, this is Accountability Media. Welcome back to my channel. In my last video, during a cop watch of a collision between an MPD cruiser and a civilian vehicle, we met MPD 4th District Officer Joshua Wilson.
Figure it out. Don't make me put up more tape. Don't make me put up more tape.
Dude, I'm on the sidewalk.
You have nothing to do with this, and you will come over here and be nosy for no reason.
If you haven't seen that video, the MPD response to a crash involving one of their own vehicles is worth the watch.
Man, y'all in the wrong. We ain't even trying to press it.
Due to Officer Wilson's apparent aggression and disdain for the citizens' constitutional rights, I did some research and discovered that the ACLU of DC has an open lawsuit against Officer Wilson and the city over an incident involving an invasive and unnecessary search that the plaintiff described as sexual assault. I requested comment from the ACLU of DC concerning the lawsuit, and they quickly set up a video call interview with Michael Perloff, lead counsel on the case.
My name is Michael Perloff. I'm an attorney with the ACLU of DC. I focus largely on police misconduct issues in the District of Columbia. And I think this issue is important because when you see police officers intrude on people's lives, whether it's through an unconstitutional search, an invasive search, taking someone's property and not returning it, physically harming someone, these kinds of injuries they're obviously devastating in the moment. They're upsetting, they cause people harm, but they're also a reminder of the government's ability to intrude in people's lives and restrict their freedom and autonomy over what they do. We see so many incidents of these sorts of things, police abuse, police violence happening in communities of color, in lower income communities, and these moments are constant reminders of the inequality in our society. And so I think standing up to police misconduct is a way to help communities that are oppressed in many ways have the sort of freedom and autonomy over their lives and their neighborhoods that they deserve. Mbamimwe Mmanzi is our client, and on January 15th, 2019, he was doing something that everyone does, just spending some time with friends, watching some television, when police officers came to the apartment he was visiting. This wasn't his apartment. They stormed in, they knocked down the door, and they ordered everyone to the ground. They got people up and they slowly searched them. Mr. Mmanzi was searched twice. Officer Wilson knew he had been searched previously, knew the search hadn't yielded any drugs or contraband, and yet chose to search him again. And when he chose to conduct that third search, he rubbed and pressed hard against Mr. Mmanzi's testicles, causing him great pain. He probed Mr. Mmanzi's buttocks. And both of these incidents and injuries caused Mr. Mmanzi sufficient pain that he sought to go to the hospital and felt physical discomfort for an extended period of time after that incident occurred. This moment didn't just affect Mr. Mmanzi physically, but it had a serious effect on him emotionally. It caused him to feel less comfortable around police officers. It caused him to feel negatively about himself. It caused him to have negative interactions in his relationships. People mocked him for this. And so this has been a moment that has had a long-term consequences for Mr. Mmanzi and should never have occurred. Because as I said, the officers had already searched him. They had not found anything on him. And the decision to search him again was unreasonable. The manner in which they searched him was unreasonable. And overall, this was completely unconstitutional and a grave violation of Mr. Mmanzi's rights. This case is the fourth case that the ACLU has brought in the past several years about a sexually invasive search. It is part of a pattern of sexually invasive searches that infects policing in the district. A recent report by NBC4 in DC found that there have been 12 complaints of sexually invasive searches by officers just in the past 2 years, and these are by 18 different officers. So I think it's really just important to look at those numbers in perspective. 4 different lawsuits, 12 different complaints. That is a tiny portion of the number of times these sorts of incidents occur because many people don't want to come forward with something as embarrassing and personal as a sexually invasive search. So I think when you look at those numbers, that's obviously disturbing. What happened in other cases? Situations very similar to what we described here. Officers probing people's groins, sticking their hands in people's buttocks areas, and causing the people who suffer these injuries to feel deeply ashamed, deeply upset, to feel as though something had been taken from them as men. I've had the chance to speak to many people who have been searched in this type of manner. All of them compare it to sexual assaults, and all of them have a great deal of difficulty talking about it and just remembering it because of the trauma that this sort of thing inflicts. And I think the final thing I should say about these searches is that all of them, at least certainly the ones that we've brought forward in our cases, I can't speak to all the complaints, but the ones that we've brought forward in our cases are unconstitutional. With respect to the first one, that was a case called McComb v. Ross. In that instance, the government settled, which is again an indication that unlawful action happened. The second case we brought forward was Cottingham v. Giacono. Again, the government settled, again indicating that there was something unlawful going on. And in the third and the most recent case, that case is currently in litigation, but we believe our clients will be vindicated there as well, because the searches that are happening are ones that aren't just humiliating, but aren't necessary to good policing. The officers who went into the apartment at issue in this case did so pursuant to a warrant, and the warrant exclusively authorized the officers to search for drugs. They did, and related paraphernalia. They did not find anything, any sort of, drugs, paraphernalia, drug documents in that apartment. Now, when officers enter an apartment pursuant to a warrant, they do have the authority to frisk people. That makes sense. It makes sense that people want to, if you're an officer, you want to, make sure that you're safe in that space. But what you can't do is frisk people multiple times. And what you certainly can't do is frisk people in an aggressive way and choose to search people's areas, manipulating their most private and sensitive body parts. This isn't just an opinion. This is a statement of law that's been affirmed by the DC Circuit and by other courts of appeal around the country. What we see with these sexually invasive searches is a pattern of behavior that is not being addressed by the higher-ups at MPD. We've seen this happen many times, and we see individual officers at times disciplined. What we're not seeing is structural policy reform. And what we're not seeing is the Chief Newsham, taking responsibility to make sure that these searches don't happen again, that officers are getting the proper training to ensure they don't happen again. Officer Sean Giacono, who was the man involved in that Cottingham case I mentioned earlier, was ultimately fired. But at his termination hearing, a sergeant named J.J. Brennan testified that he trained all the officers who worked in NSID, which is a division of the MPD, to engage in similar searches, to search people's crotch areas. There was no, after that statement, there was no decision by MPD to implement new training. There was no decision by MPD to ensure that officers were not engaging in that sort of behavior. All that happened was one officer was fired. And that sort of, looking at the individual is not the way to respond to a systemic problem. So our hope through this lawsuit is not just, and what Mr. Mamanzi's hope through this lawsuit isn't just to get accountability for Officer Wilson, but to get a comprehensive solution that makes sure that no one else has this happen to them again. We would like to learn more about how MPD is being trained on these things, and we hope to learn more about that through this litigation. One of the disturbing statements made by Officer Giacono during his hearing was that officers were told to forget everything they've learned in the academy when they're in their kind of field training session of their education. So, to the extent that there's things going on in the academy that may be helpful, it's important for that to be reinforced and certainly not discredited when officers proceed to the next stage of their education. And we think that it's indicative not just of a training regime, but a cultural regime, when higher officers are telling younger officers to forget what they learned from higher level teachers in the police department and telling them to do things that are really unconstitutional. So our hope is that MPD looks at this and thinks about ways to ensure that the training they're giving individuals at the academy and the training they're giving individuals in their field component of their education and the sorts of norms that are being reinforced on a day-to-day basis are ones that are consistent with the Constitution and consistent with just basic respect for the people in our community who have to deal with these sorts of incidents. We certainly hope that MPD, when it does engage in internal investigations of officers, keeps those officers off the streets while those investigations are pending. From our standpoint, this is a problem that obviously concerns individual officers, and we want those officers to be held accountable. But I think our number one priority is ensuring that the department as a whole is sending a message that changes the behavior of the department as a whole. So whether that means taking officers and suspending them if they have a pending civil lawsuit, if that's what it takes to get the message across, whether that's disciplining officers who are found liable for constitutional violations in serious ways, whether that's instituting a new training regime, we think everything needs to be on the table to ensure that the type of problems that we're seeing with sexually invasive searches, which are affecting many people throughout the District of Columbia, are problems that aren't occurring anymore. One of the hardest things I've done as an attorney is talk to people who have been searched in a sexually invasive way. And what I mean by that are people who have had their buttocks probed, their testicles jammed. These are extremely difficult conversations to have for people. And these are the people who have come forward. So I think it's really important to remember all the people who have not come forward and who are suffering in silence because of unconstitutional actions by officers. We as a community and MPD as a department has a responsibility to make sure that no one suffers these sorts of searches again. And it's our hope, and Mr. Mamanzi's hope, that this lawsuit will make a significant progress toward that goal.
My main takeaway from my research and my conversation with Michael Perloff is that these invasive searches that victims often describe as sexual assault are a systemic issue within MPD. While it is clear from my interaction with him that Officer Wilson does not care for the constitutional rights of citizens, and very well may have engaged in this unlawful search of the plaintiff in this case as an extrajudicial punishment for having a bad attitude, unclear department policy gives Officer Wilson and other officers cover for these invasive and unnecessary searches. While Officer Logicano was dismissed from MPD, there's been no evidence that MPD has updated training procedures or policies for these searches, and Officer Wilson remains at large and potentially dangerous in DC with a badge and gun on the streets. While normally in my video descriptions I post a link to contribute for gas and equipment to produce these videos, today I'm asking my viewers who are capable to donate to the ACLU of DC Foundation, the ACLU nationally, or your local ACLU chapter, then leave a comment so I can thank you personally. The work that Michael and the ACLU of DC, as well as the ACLU nationwide, does every day makes our police and government accountable to the people and defends our civil rights and liberties. Thank you.